Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. My name is Grant Wells. I'm Director of Innovation and Development for MCHRI here at Stanford. I'm pleased today to showcase this session on real-world data resources at the Stanford Center for Population Health Sciences, featuring Esther and Neil. We have a number of activities that I just wanted to briefly review before we get into today's talk. One, just want to thank our education committee. We have a host of folks that help put these sessions on, help us come up with some great topics, as well as partner with others to kind of um, design seminars that really bring our large community together and diverse communities. So really excited about today's session as it's one of those wonderful topics that we hope does that. Just briefly, if you haven't seen this, we really want to get the word out about the Kidney Health Innovation Awards. Please put this um, on your agenda if this is an area of need. If you're not, think about areas where you may get involved, collaborate with others, and think of really interesting topics you might be able to pursue. The submission deadline is coming up in about a week, but then you'll get a quick turnaround with the notification as well as the start date. Our next seminar is February 9th, featuring data use decoded, which is really great. If you ever wanted to know anything about data use agreements or anything related to past experiences with them, please join this seminar. It will be a wonderful topic. There has been already about 30 submissions for questions related to this. We've sent out a survey ahead of time. Please look for that if you haven't. Please fill it out so we can kind of have a really great topic-driven seminar. And then 2 weeks later, we'll have another seminar featuring our SURF grantees, so our community engaged research and action. It'll be a really wonderful seminar as we'll have not only our Stanford researchers, but we'll have partners with our community organizations presenting during that time. So that's a really wonderful activity taking place on the 23rd from 12 to 1. And then we've got another, we're just going crazy with seminars this at the start to 2026. If you have never heard of the Trial Innovation Network, this is a really wonderful resource that our CTSA and our School of Dr. Ruth O'Hara's office kind of coordinates and runs on behalf of our CTSA award, something really to take advantage of. Maya will be leading the talk as the hub liaison manager, but then joined by one of our maternal child health community members, Laura Simons. So that's something I think just to take advantage of, put this on your calendar, another really wonderful opportunity to learn more. And then coming up in May, here's another topic with Sarah Bowling. So really some interesting seminars as we kind of start 2026. Another one featuring Kyle Lowe. But without further ado, really delighted to introduce both Esther and Neil. Esther is the research engineer within epidemiology and population health. Neil is the assistant director of analytics. He's also a biostatistician. We cannot thank them enough for their time. They will talk to us all sorts about the wonderful resources that exist within the center. And I think we're hoping that we'll have some time for questions as well. So without further ado, Esther, Neil, take it away, please.
Wonderful. Thank you, Grant. I think what we'll do is I'll kind of start us off and then I'll transition over to Neil. But, we're certainly open to having this be a conversation. So if others can kind of help me keep track of any questions that come up in the chat, we can try to address them as we go or kind of come to them at the end too. We'll definitely leave time to uh, answer any questions and just talk about any one specific project they're interested in discussing. So I think, Grant, am I able to share my screen? Maybe I think it's just easiest. I'll just go ahead and share our. Yeah, looks like I can. Perfect. So while I'm loading this up, what I'll say is that Neil and I have a little bit of a dual identity in that, like all of you, we are both researchers. We write grants, we do research studies, we submit um, papers, all of that. And then we also work with other researchers to go through that whole process. And so we have this kind of instructional component of the work that we do at PHS, which is really fun to help researchers support their work and get it going. And so I'll talk about the specific different data sets that we have that all of you can access, some of the details about them, things to keep in mind. And then I'll transition over to Neil, who will talk more about the process of working with us. All right, so let's see. Does that look like a PowerPoint?
No, not at present, Esther.
Yeah,
If if necessary,
let's try it again.
oh,
I just changed my settings for sharing. Does that look good?
it's good
Awesome.
now. Yep.
Okay. So just some basic logistics for PHS. So we're physically located in the research park at the corner of Page Mill and Porter. And if you're ever in the area, please stop by and say hello. We enjoy meeting with people in person. And David Rakoff is our center director. And then our team really is pretty interdisciplinary. And that's because not only do we do research, but we also support these different computational environments. So we work with individuals like yourselves, groups of researchers. We also work with other agencies. So we work with some public health departments across the state of California, the CDC, FDA. I'll talk a little bit about our partnership with the American Board of Family Medicine as well. So today, this may be a little bit different than some of the presentations you're used to hearing, in that we're not going to be discussing our own research. Instead, what I would really like all of you to do kind of as you're thinking about this and going through the presentation is like, how can you use these resources for your own research questions? And so that's really what we're hoping that you walk away from this presentation with, or like some ideas of next steps for you to start a new research project, or if you're already using some of our data to expand your existing research portfolio. So we often refer to PHS as a data lake, and some of you may be familiar with this term, but it's this idea of this common place where all these resources are pooled and researchers can come and access all of these very large data sets in a common virtual environment. And so our job really is that we collect these data sets and then we store them, which is no small feat. They're quite large, and often they're require the highest levels of security because we do have high levels of PHI in most of the data sets. Depending upon the data set, we may have done some transformations. Of course, when we get the data, we have to unpack it, it's encrypted, and then put it up for researchers to access. But sometimes we do different types of data cleaning. And here I'll say that it's important to like communicate with our team as you're using this data and as you get familiar with it, because we do hear from researchers specific requests and interests in different data products or different cleaning, and so we can respond to those as we know about them. We also do data linkages, and sometimes this may be using geographic information about patients in a database and linking it to area level measures for that particular geographic area. And then certainly what we'll be focusing on a lot today is how we collaborate with other researchers at Stanford across the different schools. So I know there's a lot of definitions of real world data out there. I think the FDA's definition is one of the most popular. I generally tend to think of real world data as data that is collected outside of a clinical trial, or even more generally, just data that's collected not for research purposes. And it's often useful for research, but not intended initially for research. So a lot of real world data is collected passively. And by that, I mean, you know, when we're scrolling the internet, doing different clicks, if we're using GPS to navigate, purchasing items at a store, we're all contributors to real world data. And so this slide is kind of meant for you to reflect on where you are as a researcher in your involvement with real world data. And so you're contributing, maybe you're consuming professionally. So maybe you're reading articles or reviewing articles that are using real world data. An affiliate is someone that I think of who isn't directly using the data, but might be involved in a research project that is using real world data. So perhaps a content expert on the exposure or the outcome. And then a direct user is someone who's, in the data, using it, manipulating it, doing analyses with it. So hopefully we can move some of you that might be in those outer circles into the inner circle with this. So at PHS, we host all different types of data sets. And in a minute, I'm going to be talking about some of the specific ones that we host that might be of interest to your group and are accessible to you. We do host data sets that aren't health data, although that our primary focus is health and healthcare data being at the School of Medicine. So we're going to focus mostly on those top two, the healthcare claims and then the electronic medical records. So this is generally intended to give you an idea of the difference between EHR, electronic health record, and claims data sets. I would step back even further and say the main difference in these two data sets, if you're thinking about what to use, is why they were created and how patients get into these data sets. So EHR, it's intended for medical care, documentation of medical care, and patients get into that system when they seek healthcare. Versus health insurance, it's intended for billing purposes. And so patients enter that because they have a healthcare plan that's included in this data set. So I've listed some general differences of these two data sets, but there are always exceptions. So you may have EHR that does have or does have cost information, and there's some exceptions there. This is a general rule of thumb. One piece that certainly is different is enrollment. So that's something else to keep in mind for the epidemiologists out there in terms of thinking about when someone is observable. With insurance claims, you generally have a date that their health insurance begins and a date that it ends, or their coverage ends and begins. In EHR data, we don't have that. We only can see when patients are seeking care. So observability is differently defined. And I think, Neil, you guys are going to be teaching an entire class related to this. Is that right?
Yes.
In fall?
Yeah, actually, I'm always unfamiliar with what April quarter means in the Stanford speak, but I'm assuming that's spring quarter.
Okay. So keep an eye out for that, and maybe we can share that with Grant to pass around to the people on the listserv so people are aware of that. So that's a great way to learn about just how to effectively use EHR and healthcare claims data. So keep that in mind on your radar. So let's talk about some of the specific ones at PHS. So the only EHR that I'll talk about is that first one, that American Family Cohort. This is a really cool data set that we got through a collaboration with the American Board of Family Medicine. So they have a qualified clinical data registry, which basically means they have a service they provide to providers and to clinics where the providers and the clinics pay money to the registry and send them their data. And then the registry does all of the summary statistics for them and the quality metrics summaries for them. Initially, it was intended for CMS reporting. That changed somewhat. The requirements of that changed somewhat with the pandemic. But essentially, there's a research version of that data set, which is what we use and which is available to you. And so it is primarily primary care and primarily outpatient, although we do have more and more non-primary care providers, so different types of specialists. A couple other cool things about this data set to add would be the very small geographical unit. So we have information about residents down to the census block. And this is really important for people who are interested in potentially pollution exposure or social environments. We also have a household identifier in this data set. So you can see who in the data set is related to who else. And then there also are patient notes. So we've done some cool analyses looking at patient notes with natural language processing to extract information from the patient medical record on that. So lots of possibilities with American Family Cohort. You'll see we often call this our AFC data set. And maybe while I'm talking, just for our reference as we go forward, if you guys can just put in the chat which of these data sets you've used before or are currently using, just so we can kind of get a sense. I think that would be helpful too. So MarketScan is a claims data set, and this is a data set that people enter through their employer. And so these are individuals that are employed through their employer. And so it's largely commercially insured individuals. However, we can also see the other individuals that are on that same healthcare plan. So if I am insured through Stanford and I have my partner and a child also on that plan, then you'll be able to see the healthcare claims of both the primary insured, the partner, and the child. So there is a family identifier as well, which is a unique aspect of that data set, and it's huge. I would also say it's relatively clean in terms of data, and so it's a lot easier to use than some of the other data sets. So these next two, awesome, thanks, as you guys are adding some. So these next two, Medicaid and Medicare, both public insurance. So Medicaid, I'm sure this group is very familiar with, since it's, I think, maybe 40%, around 40% of births in the US are covered by Medicaid, and about 40% of US children are covered on Medicaid. I think it's even higher if you include CHIP as well. So a really, really rich data source to use for maternal and child health research. And we are very, very fortunate here to have 100%. So for the years that we have, that means everyone that was enrolled in Medicaid is in the data set. So that's just such an amazing resource to have here. And Medicaid and Medicare, just like MarketScan, include both inpatient and outpatient. So you might remember I said at the beginning with American Family Cohort, it's just outpatient. The MarketScan, Medicaid, and Medicare are all inpatient and outpatient. On our website, we'll provide like very specific details too, and I'll provide the links for you guys in a few minutes about if you want to take a look at like, does this data set have procedure codes? Does this data set have drugs and prescriptions? So all of that information is accessible. And then I've included Medicare here, and I'll talk about some examples of research projects in the area of maternal and child health that have been done using these data sets. I think a lot of times people overlook Medicare for maternal and child health research because it's most of the beneficiaries are 65 years and older, but I'll give some examples of how it might be relevant to your research as well. Then the last thing I'll just say is your data. So we do have researchers that come to us that have data. Maybe they have a group of researchers that all want to use the same data set, and we can help you provide a computational environment to store your data and access your data. We can help you with making sure only the people who should have access to that data actually have access to that data. So sky's the limit there. It can handle most data types too. So that's another great option. All right, so let's move on to a few research examples. So these aren't research projects actually that Neil and I have done. These are just research projects that I found that I thought really cool and highlighted some of these data sets. So this is a project, and the citation's here at the bottom. This is the project that used the MarketScan data set and looking at vasectomy failure rates. So they are having their exposure as a procedure. So what this team is doing is essentially going through this claims data set and looking for procedural codes or CPT and HCPCS codes that indicate a patient has had a vasectomy. And then they're using that household identifier feature in the MarketScan data set to identify a female partner of that person. And so here their outcome is pregnancy in the female partner. I thought this did a really nice job of highlighting a couple of the key features. So you have a procedural code, maybe in the inpatient, maybe in the outpatient setting, and then you have a connection to a household partner and their health outcomes here. We also have researchers at Stanford who are doing mother and infant pairs. That's also an option and possible in Market Scan. So I think that's a great feature of this data set. Okay, so this next one is a Medicaid example. So again, Medicaid claims are Medicaid public insurance, generally low income, although eligibility varies somewhat by state. This was specific to the state of Ohio. And I liked this example of a research question that was using Medicaid in part because they linked it to state vital records. So I would say that in general, death records and death information is not great in EHR or claims data sets. And that's just because if a person leaves the healthcare system, they don't know what happened to them, they don't follow them, or if a death occurs outside a medical care facility, that's also difficult to identify. And so what these researchers did is they linked these pregnancies to the vital records to look for maternal morbidity that was outside of the delivery phase. And so if you are interested in the prenatal period or the delivery, there's usually pretty good documentation and information about that in EHR and claims data sets. But if you're interested in connecting that to longer term outcomes, such as death, that might be a good way to go. Or I've also seen looking at trying to get information retrospectively about the delivery. That's another way you could go of linking it backwards to getting more information about a delivery that's just not available currently in the patient's EHR or claims data set. Okay, so last one is Medicare, and I promised I would give an example of how you might use Medicare for maternal and child health. So this is an example of these researchers looked at about 1.5 million women of reproductive age on Medicare that have a disability. And they were looking at is Medicare associated with the change in access to contraceptive use relative to other public insurance coverage. And one thing you'll notice when you use Medicare and Medicaid data is that some of the beneficiaries are dually enrolled, which means they have both Medicaid and Medicare. And then you'll often see people bouncing around. So they have one and then they have both and then they have the other. And so in some ways, if you're clever about it, you can design your study to use that to create appropriate comparison groups for individuals. And 1.5 million is, I think, a pretty decent size. Also looking at this health equity question for women with disabilities. A couple other things worth mentioning for this is I've also seen Medicare used for hormone therapy studies. There's very detailed drug information in Medicare and Medicaid, so you can look at dose, you can look at days of supply, all the detailed information about drugs there, which makes that possible. And then long-term outcomes are possible too, might be better with linkage. So with that, I want to give you guys just a few websites to use as a reference and come back to. So if you're not already familiar with our website, definitely visit our website, take a look. The data sets that I just discussed are listed on our webpage. And then if you click on each of them, you can get much more detailed information about each of those data sets. We also have a few other data sets you can see here that we've listed. Specifically, if you're interested in cancer, we have some other data sets that might be of interest to you. But take a look. There's lots of specific information on our data set as well as trainings. And then I've listed the website for Redivis, which is an interface that sits on top of the Google Cloud platform. And that's a way to access our data sets that's a bit more user-friendly than just GCP. Or just a regular Google Cloud platform environment. So get started there. And at the end, we'll provide additional resources for how you can access our tutorials, sign up for our office hours, reach out to us to be in touch. Uh, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Neil. And the last thing, I guess, actually, before I do that, I was going to say is just as you're working with these data sets, there's just a lot to consider. A lot of them have data use agreement requirements or data approval letters that are required. The computational environments are new to some people. And so I think even if you have expertise in all of these areas, my recommendation is always just don't go it alone. Like find a collaborator, delegate, work with other people. It makes for a better experience. It increases productivity. And so I guess that's a better segue perhaps to you, Neil, to kind of talk about how PHS can support that. Okay. So I'll switch it over to you and then I'll just keep the slides up. So if you just want to tell me when to scroll forward, I got you covered.
Okay, all right. I mean, I was actually thinking maybe I could try. I have this slide deck as well. I could also, if you want to stop share, I can share from this point forward. If that.
Oh, got it. Got it.
Great.
All right, I just stopped share, so.
Awesome. Okay.
Take over.
All right, I'm assuming everyone can see my screen of a slide deck. So first of all, I want to thank everyone for the opportunity to present to all of you. These have been conversations that have kind of grown organically over the last, I almost think over the last year to 2 years. And my colleague Esther and I have been engaged with maternal health and pediatrics for off and on, throughout our time. And so I wanted to transition from kind of like what PHS has been to sort of like a vision of what we are actively pursuing in terms of collaborative work. And I think that this venue and this discipline in maternal and child health is a huge area of interest for PHS as well. And so just to give some sense of, kind of like the broad spectrum of some of the work that we are both interested in and or have done, some body of work, ranging from, cognitive mental health to, gender/health equity studies, looking at socioeconomic equities, healthy aging, especially if you think about some of our studies that use, Medicare data and the older populations as well. And then surgical outcomes, cancer, cost and utilization. So some like health economic studies as well, and or cost effectiveness studies. So we sort of span the gamut. And then in terms of, if there are opportunities in your discipline that you want to research and you think that there's a way to partner with PHS and or leveraging large secondary data sources, whether it's health records or claims or even other types of registries, this is something that I think that we would implore and also encourage all of you to consider. And so one of the areas that we're really trying to build out some collaborative work is around sort of thinking about federal and foundation grant partnerships. This is, of course, in spite of our, the climate having evolved over the last year to 2 years. I think that that PHS is invested in this idea of sort of this evolution of what various forms or the phenotypes of partnering with clinical and or academic departments across Stanford medicine. And so I'm going to go through this flow chart actually to kind of like create an anatomy for this. And so a lot of the studies that we've started doing, really involve use of, our secondary data, and it would have a composition of a study team that includes a principal investigator and other co-investigators, which would include PHS. So that could include PHS faculty and staff as potential like study team leads and or providing, administrative and or like management oversight over the analytic group. And the and objectives in first phases of doing this kind of work is that you would discuss overarching goals of your project, what is the funding agency or the mechanism, and the broad research question. One of the ways that we want to engage here is that we're sort of co-creating as an intellectual partner some of this work with you. So rather than thinking, maybe some of the more prevailing thoughts has been around, data cores kind of receive analytic requests or sort of like specific, very narrow definitions around what activities analytically would be performed. This is about taking idea from its inception and creating a grant proposal that we would eventually submit. And so, a lot of the objectives here are about, we want to brainstorm and refine an aims page with you within the constraints of whatever the candidate data sources of interest. Obviously, like posit, potential hypotheses, identifying the PHS data resources, or maybe they're not even PHS data resources internally. There may be opportunities that we help facilitate those discussions with other data vendors to identify what would be most appropriate for addressing the research questions, and then developing some cadence of meetings, like recurrent meetings to discuss methodology and writing of the proposal. In terms of these partnerships, when you're thinking about preliminary data, so not only have we identified the aims, the data source, suitability, et cetera, then in part C of this is sort of thinking about can we leverage PHS data resources for developing preliminary data tables that would support feasibility of the study. This is probably where we may consider power analyses that we would help write some language. And then looking at iterating on methodologies, key personnel and budgets, and internal review of entire grant language. The idea here is that we want to actually develop a longitudinal partnership. So this would be, a point in time where you don't have funding, but you want to work with a data core to develop the intellectual product of a grant, with the interest that under the happy circumstance that you're funded, PHS and MCHRI would partner together, in the actual carrying out of both the analytic work as well as the scholarship and the manuscript products. So there's really two scenarios that come out of this, right? The scenario A, number one, is that PHS will engage the research team in the research partnership with upon successful funding. The alternative is that we'll continue to develop new grants with you. Even if one doesn't get funded, that's fine, because we're going to be continuing to develop some kind of, we'll submit to other agencies, or we'll repurpose the grant for, with other research questions in mind. And so we do operate under this notion of, working with you with analytic plan development. And so this is just sort of a skeletonized version of what we would do in terms of working with you, whether it's an analytic plan around a grant proposal, thinking about sort of like what you would propose to do as a project if you're funded, versus you are already funded and you want to kind of make a more robust analytic plan around all the different, like what are your hypotheses, what's your exposure, what are your outcomes, your inclusion exclusion criteria, your methods, and then the results, which could include figures and tables that would create the skeletonized manuscript. And so instead of grant development, there's also this idea of having partnerships where you have active funding, right? So you have an active engagement where you want to work with a data core. So PHS could serve a very niche role, especially with our core competency with large secondary data sources, with our supported claims and health record data. And so in terms of, instead of grant development, if you have a research partnership, we would be identifying, an introductory meeting where the investigator basically, meets with our analytic leadership to sort of talk through their study and sort of develop sort of an understanding about whether this would be, there would be synergies between PHS and whoever the investigators in your group that would be interested in working with us. So you look at the aims of the project and the potential data set. And we do this thing called like a mentorship model. And I'm going to talk about that for probably, about 2 minutes, because the rest of this is kind of more about how do you think of really classic partnerships where you have an analytic memo that you develop, you establish meeting cadence, you determine the scope of the scope of the work that you're doing, and then like how funding would work. And then a principal statistician or data scientist, analyst would be on the front lines of conducting the technical work. And then there's also a mentor or a lead involved on the PHS side that meet regularly to preview results, go through thinking about what are potential other avenues to explore before we bring this back to the forefront with everyone else on the study team, including the investigators. And then eventually, we talk about authorship, and so we are definitely motivated to get manuscript outputs or like abstracts for conferences, etc. And so what is the mechanism to help that happen is that everybody has investment in authorship together. And so the way I think about this mentorship model is that it's not that you're just hiring, quote unquote, this notion of hiring an analyst to support large secondary data work. It's sort of like the notion of a collaborative service. So it's sort of like PHS serves as an intellectual partner in the development of the work, and then we're also involved in sort of providing a service in a way of allowing us to accelerate the development of the analytics and then eventually the writing of the research products. So we do have this mentorship model built in where you have a Stanford like PHS mentor for the lead data scientists, and then they can tap into their analytic network, which is other Stanford PHS colleagues. And then on the green side is more for your group where you have a principal researcher and other researchers who really serve as subject matter experts. And the reason that I think that this is so valuable and it's so overlooked is that this is really getting to the core of the notion of team science. And I know a lot of times people talk about team science, but then it's great in concept, like the conceptual framework is great, but the implementation and the practice of it seems to be where a lot of times it falters. And so the idea here is that PHS is a strong advocate for this team science-based approach to developing these studies, whether it's grant development or actual funded projects that are active research activities. And the reason that we have two analytic people on a team is also to create redundancy in the type of work that's being done. So, there's reproducibility around people can share their codes and algorithms. And also if someone is, either they go on disability or they have something else that happens to him or her that they're going to be out for a period of time, there's enough knowledge exchange and transfer between multiple people that the work and the progress can continue. And so the whole idea of the partnership is that once you've developed the analytic memo and we establish a meeting cadence, and then these all go through this iterative process of developing the paper and then eventually for dissemination of findings into some kind of manuscript or conference presentation. We sometimes, depending on the studies and depending on, if there is something more pressing in terms of an abstract deadline, is that we sometimes can construct this. This is very much more of like a project management piece of this, is that you can have different sprints. So this is an arbitrary notion of a sprint where you may have 2 week blocks of time, and then there's certain activities that we want to accomplish that would keep the project moving along. And so we may have sprints that occur at each of these at each of those junctions where you have meetings, and then we'll review and iterate at each of those points in time. And so when you think about this notion of sprints, and this is more regimented than I think it ends up being, because this is research and we want to make sure that we're doing things thoughtfully, is that you can think of a sprint beginning. You have tasks, which is really just like, what are the kinds of exploratory activities that you want to do? And then output would be tables or figures that you want to present. Collaborative review would be either with your internal mentors and other colleagues, and or it's sort of like jointly between both departments. We incorporate feedback, finalize, and then we go around again with the next sprint. And so I want to thank all of you for this opportunity for Esther and I to share with everybody here. And I'm looking forward to hearing questions, feedback, and comments. Thank you.
Neil, I have a comment that might help kind of spur some other discussion too. One of the things is that I think related to what you were sharing is most of the data sets are associated, particularly for funded projects, with a fee, and sometimes that's like overwhelming to researchers or infeasible, right? Just depending upon the funding environment. And so I think one thing that PHS is absolutely trying to do is really meet researchers where they are in that process that you described. And so we certainly engage with people when they don't have funding and trying to help kind of get them to the next level. And so I would love to hear just from people that are thinking about starting a project, or anyone that wants to use their particular exam or idea or something as an example. It would be a great opportunity for us to kind of workshop, or we can certainly share from experience. But
Esther, I agree, and and our objective as a team is, of course, to accelerate and lower some barriers of access for thinking of thoughtful questions around these data. Um, are there, as a like maybe like as a show of hands, is there an interest? Do you have new grant ideas or areas of interest that you believe that some of these secondary data sources where you've not thought too much about it because maybe of its complexity or its cost, that you would like to engage PHS to think about co-creating proposals? I think David, you
Thank you
unmuted.
for this great talk and all the resources you guys are providing. I think for a lot of my colleagues, I'm over in psychiatry. There's a lot of great questions at the population level that would be a complement to kind of smaller scale science that's being done in either different kinds of data sets, et cetera. I guess I have two questions. One of which is, um, how would we find out like what are the data components or the data elements that are in some of these larger data sets that would align with something that we're doing? Like we're investigating a question in a more local enriched clinical sample, and then we would go back and say, okay, if we looked at this at a larger scale across the entire health system in Medicare or Medicaid, for example, to look at utilization of like a similar finding, if we can extrapolate with noisier and messier data, is there a way we could quickly find out ourselves like what is included in those larger databases? Sorry, this is a very novice question because I'm not familiar with the databases you have.
Esther, do you want to take that, or do you want me to take it?
Sure, I can. Yeah, David, I think that's a perfect question. So one thing is if you go to our website, there is some more information on the data sets, but you can also create an account for that Redibus portal that I mentioned, and you can read more about some of the summary data sets. Uh, the other piece is, as Stanford researchers, you guys get the special ticket. So you can also just come to our office hours or send us an email or shoot an email to this help desk and say like, hey, I'm interested in the use of these 5 medications among women aged such and such to such and such. Do you have any data sets that would have that information? And we can we'll come back to you and say, yeah, it looks like there were 100,000 women in the market scan data set that had that prescription between these years or something like that, just to kind of get you started. That's often how people get started. Or they'll come to our office hours and say like, hey, this is my research question. What data set do you think I should use? And then we can walk through like, okay, these data sets are going to have your sample or you'll be able to identify your cohort. And then usually it comes down to how long does it take to get access to the data sets? Sometimes it's a week, sometimes it's much longer, depending. And so, we try to get people started with something if they do want to work. CMS is, of course, the data sets that take a lot more time. They require a data use agreement. We've done a lot of those, and now I'm going to brag for our team, we have 100% so far track record of getting those approved. So we're happy to work with people. We've gotten experience about what do you say, how do you do it, but just reach out to us. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Will do. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to add one thing to what Esther said, is that I think Esther's recommendation makes a lot of sense, right? It resonates that, you can go through this portal, find out a little bit about the data, ping our team with a question. And then a lot of times when you ask the question, especially with these data, there's always a ton of caveats associated with them. And it's like, you think about single center studies that have a lot of clinical depth, but you don't have the population level breadth that you're probably looking for. And so a lot of times you have to kind of think about your question within the context of large population level data and whether you can make some concessions for what it is that you're really trying to interrogate the data to address. And so I find also a lot of times, like after you've done that initial exploratory work, that it may, as a rule out, schedule a time, meet with us, and then kind of talk it out a little bit, and then we can provide both feedback on, you could answer these questions, or here's like an alternative strategy which may still maybe tangentially answer your question. So that I think there's a lot that can be gained also through having a meeting and just kind of discussing the study, the conversations around that, and like what work has been done and what is like a low-hanging fruit that you could do with these data sets as well.
Yeah, literature reviews are also a great place to start because with this type of research, when you're defining an outcome or an exposure, a lot of times people will use a validated exposure or validated outcome, which means they're looking at something that's already been published and someone's already created this list, right? And they're literally saying, okay, we're going to say that you have a diagnosis of major depressive disorder if you've had one of these diagnosis codes and you've had this medication in this period of time, or however you want to define it, right? There's lots of different ways that might be meaningful for your specific research project. That's often how people start. So if you are looking at the literature and you see something that catches your eye, that's a great way to get thinking about how to use this type of data. How would it work for a population health question? So I myself started working in researching clinical trials. And so a sample size of 1,000 was like a lot of people. And now our data sets, of course, have millions of people. So it's a huge shift for a lot of researchers.
Are there any other questions or thoughts?
No additional questions, but thank you so much for the presentation and all of the resources and all of the great work that your team does.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.
So